Okay, let's look at argument 2. So I want you to see if you can find a premise indicator in here, and that is it. Pause the video and then come back to check the answer, and then I'll lead you through this application exercise in an interactive way. Okay, I'm going to assume that you took advantage of the opportunity to try for yourself to see if there is perhaps a premise indicator. You should have noted the word for. The word for typically tells us a premise is coming. Let's go ahead and reread the argument together. You should have read this already. Former President Trump is not fit to be president, for presidents must be civil and classy, and Trump is far from civil or classy. So you might be a Trump lover, so of course you're going to need lots of intellectual empathy, especially if this is triggering for you, to see what the reasoning is for this position. So here you can see that this argument is pro-Biden against Trump. This one is pro-Trump and by implication against Biden. So as you can see, I'm trying to make sure that more people than not have the opportunity to practice putting their own views aside, their own biases aside, their own opinions aside. Also, I do want to clarify, because I don't know that I did this during lecture, that intellectual empathy, we practice it not only when a view is different from ours or opposes ours. You also practice intellectual empathy when you come to understand that someone has the same view, logic, or definitions for a concept that you do. And in fact, you don't even know that someone has the same logic or reasoning for an argument until you try to understand what they have to say in their argument. So that is a big misunderstanding that some people have about intellectual empathy, and specifically about intellectual empathy in arguments. Anytime you are trying to correctly and fairly take apart an argument to see what's a premise and a conclusion, you are reflecting or trying to reflect intellectual empathy, to mention one, even if at the end you realize you agree. Because intellectual empathy isn't about whether you agree or disagree. It's about, do you understand the point being made in terms of the different parts for the point. It doesn't matter whether you agree or disagree or have the same or similar view. Okay, so that tells us the word for probably indicates, since we are working with simple arguments, that is a premise. So we could write the word P, the letter P with the question mark. Maybe we haven't made a final decision, right? So it seems like in this simple argument that they are using as a reason for their conclusion that presidents must be civil and classy. Now, I realize, I think I might want to add something to our notes right here. Premise indicator. Oh no, let's go to this lesson right here. When we are giving premises, okay, we are giving what are also known as, so AKA, and then right here, I want you to write reasons. Reasons to believe something. Reasons for something. Okay, so with that said, let's go ahead and go back to this part of the lesson. All right, so we've got this. It sounds like they're saying, well, here comes a reason, right? And notice that the word for, in fact, let's start circling our indicators. Therefore, let's circle the word for, okay? So for has scope over statement 2, but notice that they have another statement 3. In other words, this is also functioning as a premise probably. And when we think about the definition for argument, and we know that this is a simple argument, and we know that we're starting with more basic, easier arguments because we're learning this method, then we can infer by process of elimination and definition of the term argument that this is likely to be the what? Conclusion. Former President Trump is not fit to be president. That is the main point. That is what the speaker or the author is trying to convince you of. So they make that claim, and then they try to give you reasons to believe the conclusion. They give you premises, reasons to believe the conclusion. Now listen very carefully, guys, because students mess up on this a lot, even though I try to reinforce this idea carefully. The word for has scope over premise 2. Okay, so that's what the arrow means. I shouldn't say premise 2, that's statement 2, but that's the first premise, okay? So for has scope over premise 2. So the word for has scope, and the arrow means over premise 2. But the word for also has scope over, and again, I shouldn't call that premise 2, that's statement 2. I could say that's premise 1, but the word for also has scope over premise 2, which happens to be statement 3. So notice the difference between a statement number and a premise number. This would make a great true-false question, extra credit question, bonus points question during a verbal oral quiz or a written one. If I said how many statements are in this argument, you should say 3, right? If I say how many premises in the argument, you would say what? 2. If I say how many conclusions, well, it's a simple argument, so of course it has only 1. So if I said, hey, would it be correct to label this premise 2? You would say no. It is statement 2, but it's the first premise, right? So statement 2 is premise 1. Here, statement 3 is premise what? 2. So know the difference between a premise number and a statement number. We do not number premises inside an argument, so never do that. And in fact, you might want to write that as a special note right here. Never number individual premises. In fact, I'm making it mandatory. Say never number individual premises. Okay? Don't do that. It's probably just going to confuse you. All right, so let's go back to, we got to do the argument pattern. So we write argument. You can use an abbreviation for argument. I'm cool with that, but I want you to write out the word pattern, okay? So let's reinforce the idea of an argument pattern. An argument pattern tells us only the order of the statements by function in an argument. So what is the order of the statements by function in argument 2? Well, in this case, what comes first? The conclusion. And what symbol do we use to symbolize followed by? Or what comes next? The dash, not an arrow. Then what comes, statement 2 comes after statement 1, and the function of statement 2 is what? A premise. It's there to provide support. It's trying to support statement 1, a conclusion, so then we write P. While statement 3 is another premise, we will not add a dash and a P. Why? We go back to our lesson. What did our lesson say? Our lesson said that P means at least one premise. So the way that we read our work here is that in argument 2, we have at least one conclusion, and then what comes next is a statement that functions as a premise, or there's at least one. So this is the better way to read it. There's at least one statement in the original argument. That first statement functions as a conclusion. What comes next, what follows that, is at least one other statement. There could be more. And its function as a premise. It's attempting to support statement 1, a conclusion. So this leaves open the possibility that there is more than one premise. So does this. It turns out there's only one premise, but remember, the meaning of P in patterns for simple arguments is at least one. So this accurately captures this, and this actually captures this, even though there's 2 premises. Okay, now I need to do a quick lecture on 4. So go back to these notes. Notice that I have the word for. For does not, like many of these words, always function as a premise indicator. If I said, what are you doing that for? Of course, that's a question, but I'm not using for to give you a premise. If I said, well, I think that's all I want to say. So just remember, you have to keep these words you have to keep the context in mind with these words. Now, I am calling your attention to the word for, so that you can recognize that sometimes you are going to see the word for, but you're going to see it in a bigger phrase. So seeing the word for by itself does not tell you whether you're looking at a conclusion, possibly, or a premise, possibly. Again, you have to use your critical thinking and careful reading comprehension. Here, the word for is used in combination with for these reasons. Remember that reasons is another word for premise. So this phrase says, I've already given you my premises. And in fact, I want you to write that here, okay? What does this mean? In parentheses, I already gave you premises. And you can just use P with an apostrophe to mean premises. So for these reasons mean, I already gave you the premises. Here comes my what? Conclusion. So again, you have to be mindful of how the words are being presented to know whether or not they are functioning as a premise or a conclusion indicator. Now notice this. For these reasons, guys, I messed up. I don't know if it's COVID. So we shouldn't have for this reason, okay? That's a conclusion indicator. And in fact, I thought about redoing this video, but I'm not, because this will keep you on your toes if we ever have to move class to online again. I'll know that you've watched all the videos if I made a mistake and then I don't fix it till later. Okay, so what I want you to write here is instead, do I already have that? The reason being, my reasonings are, so no, that's fine. I think that is good. So we're just going to get rid of that completely. Okay, so notice that this one says the reason being, the reason is. Okay, this also has the word reasons. So again, we have to be careful, right, when we are looking at these words. You have to slow down and really look at the words and the context they're in. Don't be so quick to jump to conclusions about a word and what it's telling you the function of a statement is. You might see the word reasons, but that doesn't mean that you are getting a premise or a conclusion in and of itself. If you see reasons used with a phrase like for these, then you know that you're probably getting a conclusion or a conclusion indicator. If you see reason being used like this, the reason being, my reasoning is, then that is telling you that you might be getting a premise. Hence, they are functioning as, or probably functioning as premise indicators. Okay, we will do a separate video for our last example and our last video in this session.